Good morning, everyone. I am Armando El Khoury, and I greet you from Washington, D.C. at the Maronite Seminary. It's wonderful to have you with us. Today is the first talk of 3 talks. It's called the Maronite Enrichment Days. And we have invited Father Rodrigue Constantine to give us a talk on John of Apamea. My job for now is to explain to you the logistics of this meeting, how it works. The most important thing is that I would like you to know that you are muted and you will not be able to unmute yourselves unless I ask you to do so. And you will have time to ask questions for our main speaker at the end of his talk. I also would like to let you know that you are being recorded. This talk is being recorded and it's being live streamed on YouTube. At the end of the talk, if you'd like to ask questions, right below the feed, video feed, there is an icon for reactions. If you click on it and click on raise hand, and we will be able to call upon you. I will be able to call upon you when I see your hand being raised. And when it's time for you to ask the questions, I will ask you to unmute yourself. And then when you do so, you may ask the question. I would like to thank Bishop Gregory Mansour and Bishop Zaidan and Monsignor Fahad, Director of the Seminary, for sponsoring this event. And I would like also to thank our main speaker, Father Rodrigue Constantine. And now I would like to give the mic to the Rector of the Seminary.
Good morning, everyone. And Christ is risen, he is truly risen. As rector of the Maronite Seminary in Washington, D.C., I take great pride in welcoming all the attendees of the series of our enrichment days. Allow me to warmly thank our bishops for their continued support of such enriching conferences. I am grateful to my brother priest, Reverend Dr. Armando El Khoury, the Vice Rector, for having brought us together to these wonderful cities of Zoom and YouTube, the computer-generated meetings. We congratulate our guest speaker, Reverend Dr. Rodrigue Constantine, for his accomplishments and his generous time and effort in presenting this important series of talks, and for giving me the privilege of welcoming and addressing all of you. For me, it is an honor and delight. These talks will be dedicated to cover themes related to moral growth. I am extremely happy to recognize and express our sincere appreciation to the clergy, scholars, professors, colleagues, friends, and laity who are joining us from around the world. I applaud all of you for your commitment and active participation and wish you all the success. I hope that you will find the conference both valuable and enjoyable. Thank you for your attention, and may God bless you.
Thank you, Monsignor Peter. Thank you, Father Armando, Bishop Zaidan, and Reverend Dr. Rodrigue Constantine. I noticed that Sebastian Brock is with us. I acknowledge you and the beautiful work that you have done. And I would like to just say a word about this hopeful topic that Father Rodrigue has written about. I didn't read every page of his, but I read through as much as I could. And it's a beautiful work. And what hit me the most with such a positive feeling was that there's debate whether or not a human being can make progress in the moral life. And sometimes I think I'm making progress, and sometimes I think I'm going in reverse. So hearing from John of Apamea, or John the Solitary, say that it is possible for moral advancement for a human being to reach he doesn't say that we reach perfection. I'll leave that to our author, but But he does say that it's possible to make a difference in our ability to embrace the good and to repel what's evil. And with that, I felt that he was very much like Ignatius of Loyola, trying to find a way in which human beings, by prayer and penance and repentance, can make a way towards God. So that's first. I look forward to this talk. And second is the unique way in which the Syriac fathers speak about this moral improvement, which is unique for the church. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Bishop Zaidan, who will introduce our speaker. But again, thank you, Father Rodrigue, for your good work with this.
Thank you, Bishop Gregory. Thanks to all of you and greetings. Our guest speaker today is first is a priest in the Eparchy of Our Lady of Lebanon of Los Angeles. He got interested in the Syriac theology and Syriac fathers back when he was even at the age of 18, and when he entered also the Maronite Lebanese order, and he was a novice there. And from there, he went to earn a bachelor's degree and psychology, bachelor in psychology and theology from the Holy Spirit University. Back in 2001, I met him in Lebanon person, and he moved to the States where he went further into studies and everything. And he was ordained priest in 2003. From pastoral point of view, has been, even at when he was still a deacon, he became in charge of a parish, Holy Family Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. And while there, he went and got also a master's degree in theology at St. Paul's Seminary and a master's degree in counseling psychology at the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis. After serving so many years, he felt he needed to go further for PhD, and he cannot do both at the same time like he did for his master. He wanted to take time more to study and dedicate. He moved to Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., where he earned his PhD in moral theology. And while there, he was teaching at the undergraduate levels, and his focus was, he authored dissertation, Passions, Virtue, and Moral Growth in John of Apamea's Dialogue on the Soul. And it's interesting, what people now don't think about that, they move into something direction, they need time for their own to go and see who they are as well. His academic focus include virtue ethics, the dialogue between psychology and theology, and definitely the Syriac patristics. Father Rodrigue, Dr. Rodrigue is an intelligent person himself with a lot of talents. I know many of those as well in many ways. Will definitely benefit from his knowledge and experience. And right now, as he serves at San Rafael in Livonia, Michigan, he also teaches at Sacred Heart Major Seminary for the Archdiocese of Detroit and Madonna University. With all this background, definitely you and I will be enriched today in knowing more about John Apamea and Father Rodrigue knowledge and expertise. Thank you, Father Rodrigue, for your willingness to share your knowledge with us.
Bishop Zaidan, thank you. Bishop Gregory, thank you. Monsignor Peter and Father Armando, appreciate the introductions. Maronite Enrichment Days are supposed to be for non-scholars, people I did not actually use in my dissertation to introduce them to John of Apamea. So I appreciate everyone's attendance. This is meant to be informal, and so I feel like I have to apologize to the scholars who have attended. I hope I can add an iota to your knowledge of John the Solitary. Let me share the screen with you for my PowerPoint. I hope you're able to see it. So this is the first talk is on the diseases of the soul, because before we talk about moral growth, we need to talk about what is the problem, what is the human predicament. And the expression diseases of the soul is one that John of Apamea himself uses. I'd like to dedicate this talk to Mary Hansberry, who passed away March 2nd, and who has translated the dialogue on the soul in 2013, and it was the first full English translation of the work. So to her, I dedicate this talk. So the I think it's important to talk about John of Apamea and the dialogue on the soul in itself, because John of Apamea has been studied a lot from an historical, Christological, theological perspective, but not really from what I call a moral perspective. Now, some people might say, talk of passions, talk of virtue and moral growth, that's in the area of spirituality, especially if you come from a European background in theology, because that's the classical distinction between spiritual theology and moral theology. But in the United States of America, since the 60s, there has been a revival of what we call virtue ethics, as part of moral theology. Because before that, there were basically the schools of moral theology were focusing on utilitarian theories and deontology, but they looked at the acts of the person and determined whether how the person acts is moral or not. Virtue ethics turned the focus on who the good person is. What qualities, what traits does the moral person have? And that's how virtue ethics became part of moral theology. Now, in Western moral theology, Thomas Aquinas and Augustine are the go-to traditional figures, classical figures in virtue ethics. So when I studied at Catholic U, these were the figures I was introduced to. And then I started thinking, do we have anyone in the Syriac tradition that has talked about moral growth, has talked about what virtue is and about passions and their role in moral growth? And this is how I came across John the Solitary, and I read the dialogue on the soul, and I thought, that's it, Eureka. That's the guy I need to study. That will be the contribution of Syriac, Christian Syriac literature to the current conversation in moral theology on virtue ethics. I will proceed in 3 parts after introducing the author and the work. I don't know what this line. Armand, do you know what that red line is? Is that on my end only, or what is that?
No, somebody drew it. I'm not sure how they did it.
Well, looks good. It's the ads. Makes it more interesting. So after introducing the author and the work, I will, on the first part, I will lay the foundation for understanding the diseases of the soul by talking about John's anthropology. Then I'll talk about what the passions themselves are. And then lastly, I will focus on why and how passions are, in what sense they are diseases of the soul. There's a debate on who John of Apamea is and whether he's 1 or 2 or 3 persons. And that's because, for a lot of reasons. One, there are many people named John of Apamea in these early centuries of Christianity. There are over 90 works attributed to someone not named John of Apamea or John the Solitary. And these works are different in a theological framework. So there's still debate till today, although now most people agree most scholars agree there were more than one John of Apamea. There couldn't be one person who had that many theological frameworks. But I can happily circumvent that issue because I'm focusing on one work. And that work is attributed to John of Apamea, also known as John the Solitary, who is a 5th century ascetic and Syriac author. He was based on his knowledge of medicine and his knowledge of Greek concept and philosophy, which he may have acquired through, as a Roman citizen, he could have acquired that through Greek paideia, or through his knowledge of the Greek fathers, but we know that he was aware of Greek philosophy and medicine, so he was educated, although most likely he only wrote in Syriac. He is also a renowned spiritual teacher, as we can tell from the letters that he sent to monks, and the monks that have visited him, including the 2 Eusebius and Eutropius, who visited him in his hermitage. they traveled all the way from Palestine. His reputation has reached all the way to Palestine, and they heard of him and they wanted to come and seek his advice. So we know he's a renowned spiritual teacher. Now, the dialogue on the soul itself, the full title, the dialogue on the soul and the passions of men. The manuscript that I use, and the oldest extant manuscript, is from 581, the year 581. So that's the terminus ad quem of John's life. According to Dualu's research, based on the Christology that is present in these early writings and of John the Solitary, and the vocabulary and his lack of concern in the Chalcedonian controversy, likely he wrote between 430 450. As of now, nobody has disputed those dates, and since I'm not a historian or a Christologist, I accept that date. The dialogue itself is composed of 4 discourses. They're divided in 4, and in it, 3 people are talking. The solitary, Eutropius and Eusebius. The dialogue is presented as the notes that Eutropius has taken, but it's written in the form, the traditional Greek form of a dialogue. Now, why it's important? Because the dialogue on the soul is distinct in terms of themes and genre, especially compared to, if you compare him to the 2 biggest figures before him and after him, or 3, Ephraim and Ephraim on one hand, and Jacob of Serug later on. Because first, it's in prose. John the Solitary did not write much in poetry. The dialogue itself is in prose. It's also, like I said, it's in the Greek form of a dialogue. And the themes in there, of moral growth, of in-depth psychology, these are not themes that you see in these authors that I've named addressed in the same, given the same attention. So it is really distinct in its genre and its themes, and that's why I think it deserves this kind of attention. And of course, as a moral theologian, because it's a contribution to modern virtue ethics, and to also Christian counseling, because as I'll talk, as I'll present in the third talk, John is not only interested in diagnosing human diseases, but he's also, and more even, interested in healing them in therapy. So let's talk about how John understands the human being. John's anthropology mirrors his cosmology. He understands the cosmos as a duality. I wouldn't say dualism because they're not in conflict with one another, but it's a duality of visible and invisible. He says that reality is actually dual. What we see with our own senses is the visible part, the tangible part, but inside that creation is the workmanship and the wisdom of God, which is invisible to us. And so he says that the human being, just like the cosmos, also is composed of 2 substances, one that is visible, the body, and one that is invisible, the soul, which he calls the wisdom put by God in us at creation. So the man himself is also a duality. And within this duality, there are positive aspects of partnership between body and soul, but there's also some conflict between them. Now, this anthropology is also hierarchical. Although both body and soul are fundamentally good, they're both created by God. So we're here far from Platonic or Neoplatonic dualism. But so although body and soul are both good, created by God, the soul is definitely superior to the body, according to John. He calls the soul the true person, Barnosho Dashuro, Barnosho Sheriro. And that's because he considers that it's the essence of being human. Being human is defined by having a soul, because he considers the animals not to have a soul. Now, some philosophers, some theologians have argued that animals have some kind of soul, a lower soul, but they had a soul. For him, animals are simply soulless bodies. And only humans have been honored with a soul by God. And that's why our soul is our true person. And he also considers the soul to be the true person because in eschatology, he views our transformation as based on how St. Paul talks about it. The transformation of the human person is a transformation where the person becomes spiritualized, if you will. He says that in this life, we act more under the influence of our bodies, of our senses. The body has the upper hand in this life, but in the next life, the soul will take over. We will be vested and clothed in the properties and the ways of thinking of the soul. So that's another reason why, for him, the soul is the true person, the essence of being human. Another characteristic of the soul is for him that the soul is created virtuous by God. Kyono Shafiro. I know Shafiro could be also translated as beautiful, but that's one of the terms that Shafiro and Metro are the two words that John uses for virtue. The soul for him is created naturally good, which also made me question wonder what he thinks of the fall of Adam and Eve, what he thinks of what the West calls original sin, and he doesn't elaborate much on that, at least in the writings that I've seen. But for him, the soul is created naturally good by God. He says God has placed virtue in us at the creation of our soul. So if the soul is created as naturally good, then vice is against the soul's nature. So, and that's that also is, you may hear echoes of the Stoic the Stoic notion of vice being against nature. That's also something we find in Evagrius, and via probably under the influence of the Stoics. So he says that evil deeds occur when human beings are not acting in accordance with shalmuta, in accordance with the good nature in them, or with the Lord's commandments. So this is an understanding of really of goodness and acting morally as being healthy for us, as being conducive to our growth, because it is in accordance with our good nature. And vice, in a sense, is stranger, is an intruder onto our being and onto our life and behavior, which is different from really thinking of being weak and being morally frail as the essence of humanity. No, actually, our essence is naturally virtuous, as God has willed it. So, in this sense, vice is a disease, a kibo, an illness, kurohono of the soul. Like I said, this notion is present in Evagrius and in the Stoics before him, and we see it prominently. We see it in a prominent way featured in the Dialogue of the Soul. It talks about vice as disease. Now, vice is manifested in us as evil thoughts and passions. So vice for him is not simply a habit, it's not simply vicious acts, but it starts as, and it can be synonymous with, evil thoughts and passions before it is translated into acts. Now, what is the role of the body here? Now, to be sure, again, John is not Neoplatonic, and so he sees definitely positive aspects to the soul being in the body. He talks about the soul being clothed in the body, which at some point was the way Syriac theologians talked about the incarnation of Christ. He was clothed with the body. So for him, the soul being given a body, the embodiment of the soul, is willed by God. It's not a punishment. It's not because it's not the result of the fall. It's a embodiment is willed by God. And even more so, the fact that the soul is in a body is what motivates the soul to reflect on creation and marvel in God's wisdom. He says, because the body has needs, and because the body has needs for material things, then the soul, to take care of the body, has to inquire about the world, has to inquire about nature, about the structure of the universe. And he says that as the soul does that, as the soul reflects on creation, the soul will discover the wisdom of God embedded in creation. So that's a very positive corollary of the soul being in the body. And also, there's that whole partnership in knowledge between body and soul. He believes that the soul without the body would not reflect on things, but because the body perceives things, then the soul reflects on them. Knowledge goes from the five bodily senses to the senses of the soul, or spiritual senses, as Origen calls them. And so there's this partnership, epistemological partnership between body and soul. All these are positive aspects of being in the body, which I wanted to, again, present and highlight just to make sure we understand that for him, the body is not fundamentally. Yet, the body can be problematic from a moral point of view. For him, the body has needs and appetites and desires. And all these can motivate one to act in a certain way in accordance with these bodily needs and desires, what he calls the will of the body. But these needs and desires are not always virtuous, and they can conflict with the will of the soul, which for him is always virtuous. And sometimes if these needs and appetites are too intense, they can even overpower and hijack the will of the soul. Because for him, the soul without the body would not be tempted to follow these desires, would not be tempted to vice. It's only because it's in the body that the soul is tempted to sin, if you will. So that's one reason why being in a body is morally problematic. And it's these needs and appetites of the body that are at the core of the passions. We have passions because our body has needs and appetites. For him, the body is the cause of the passions. The soul by itself naturally experiences no passions because it's created virtuous by God. So that's why, for him, the body in that sense can be morally problematic. Now, let's talk about what the passions are in themselves. In modern literature, passions are often translated as emotions, especially when scholars translate works of the Stoics. But passions are more than just how we understand emotions. In ancient philosophy, passions are multidimensional. They can have a bodily dimension where when you feel an emotion, you actually feel it in your body, like you shake when you're afraid. you feel heat inside of you when you get angry. You feel actually pain in your stomach and your heart when you feel sad, etc. So it has a bodily dimension, it has a feeling dimension, but also it has a cognitive dimension. Because when I'm sad, I'm sad about certain specific state of affairs. I'm sad because my brother has passed away. I'm sad because my lover has abandoned or rejected me. When I'm happy because something good has happened to me. So passions have both these dimensions of bodily experience, but also a cognitive dimension. And they're also intentional in the sense they have an object. When I desire, my desire is vectorially projected towards a certain object. It's not blind. It's not random. Now, in the dialogue of the soul, John does not define what passions are. He doesn't say passions are this or that, but he often talks about passions in tandem with thoughts. He talks about evil thoughts and passions. And sometimes some passages, you wonder if he equates the two. Are passions simply thoughts for him, or are they something more than just evil thoughts? Now, we know famously for Evagrius, he talks about the 8 thoughts, the logismoi, as precursors to passions, And he focused on the evil thoughts because he theorized that if you keep your thoughts under control, then they do not develop into passions. If you don't entertain these thoughts, they don't become passions. So for the Stoics themselves, passions were thoughts. They were dysfunctional thoughts. So throughout philosophy, there has been a debate on the connection between the cognitive dimension and the emotional dimension, if you will. And John does not say whether, in some passages, he seems to distinguish thoughts from passions. In some, he seems to equate them. But passions for him on the moral plane can be either neutral passions, like he talks about fear, for example. When fear is fear of the world, it's bad. When it's fear of God, it's good. He talks about vicious passions, passions that are always vicious, things like envy, like greed. These are always vicious for him. And it talks about good passions. What he names good passions are joy, love, humility, for example, which sound more like virtues. And these are also, these echo the Stoic eupatheia. They talk about good passions also, although for them, apatheia is the moral ideal to reach. John himself does not, unlike Evagrius and the Stoics, does not have an ideal of apatheia. He wants to spiritualize the passions. He has two categories of passions. The first one he calls the passions of the body, which are largely about bodily needs and appetites like sleep, hunger, thirst, sexual appetite, and luxury. The category I'm more interested in is what he calls the passions of the soul. And these seem to be passions of a higher order. They're passions that involve more cognition, more thoughts, and they seem to be more relational, like haughtiness, which is basically self-appraisal. You praise yourself against somebody else. Envy, you envy someone else. Anger, you're angry towards someone else. They seem to be more relational. Among the passions of the soul, is interesting to see three passions in particular: anger, discernment, and desire. Now, my theory is that unlike the rest, which are clearly vices, anger and discernment and desire are an import from Platonic psychology. As you know, Plato has a tripartite psychology. He sees that the soul, he considers the soul to be composed of desire, anger, and reason. And my hypothesis is that the reason why something like discernment is treated as a passion of the soul is because John read the three parts of the soul of Plato as three powers of the soul, as three passions of the soul. But the rest tend to be vices. And these are what he will consider as diseases of the soul. Now, why are passions diseases of the soul? Why are something like envy and boastfulness and pride and anger, why are these bad for moral growth? The first reason is epistemological. Passions impact the mind. He calls them blindness of the mind. And they can distract the mind, they can trouble and shake our reasoning. As we know, when you're in the thralls of a passion, you're very angry. When you're very sad, you cannot think straight. And so for him, before one can learn anything, whether it's regular science or theology, one has to heal the passion so that the mind is able to learn. I like to quote him here. He says, "It is helpful for man that before all else he be diligent about his passions, so that after purifying the soul from them, it would be appropriate for him to seek the study of all sciences." And he gives this analogy. He says, "It is like a man whose body is afflicted with illness, and his limbs are full of gangrenous ulcers. It is not suitable for him to pursue the study of crafts. He ought first to be diligent about curing his ulcers. And then, once he is healthy, it is appropriate for him to learn about all things." So for him, healing the passions is a prerequisite to learning. But it's not only regular knowledge, also theological knowledge for him. Passions for him are problematic because they impede our knowledge of the mysteries of God. And for him, this knowledge of the mysteries of God is an eschatological knowledge. For him, the mysteries of the other world, of the new life, can be given to us by grace from God. But passions can be obstacles before the human mind that impede that true vision of the world to come. Because for him, that's the most precious knowledge that God wants to give us, is what our future glory consists of in the next world. So even our meditation, our knowledge of theology is impacted by the passion if our mind is not free to perceive it. Third reason, our passions have a moral impact, and by moral I mean in terms of behavior, in terms of sinful behavior. For him, evil thoughts and evil passions lead to sinful deeds because one of the feature of emotions is that it's not simply us feeling or experiencing things. It's not simply a state, but they also motivate us to act in a certain way. So let's say when you're sad, you're motivated to get rid of that sadness, overcome that sadness, to do things that alleviate that sadness. When you desire something, you are sometimes physically motivated to go and satisfy that desire. You see, beautiful apple. You see, at the end of the table, you are motivated to go and grab it and eat it. So passions are also a motivator of behavior. And when they are evil passions, when they're disease passions, they can lead to sinful deeds. So that's the third reason why passions can be problematic. And he makes a claim that those who are troubled by evil deeds are not so because of lack of knowledge of things, but entirely because of their lack of diligence concerning evil passions. He said that we do the wrong things not because we don't know right from wrong, but we don't have the psychological and emotional freedom to pursue the virtuous things because of our passions. And that's why we need to attend to these evil passions and thoughts in order to act morally. I think that's very progressive for Christian author in the 5th century. Fourth reason why passions are problematic, are diseases, because passions blind our mind and distort our way of thinking as to make us overvalue the goods of this life, which are ephemeral and passing. Here, I'd like to give a little bit of background on concept of fondness and Stoicism because it's very close to how John views passions. In Stoicism, there's a category of bad character that they call sickness, and it's a disposition of one's character. It's not a one-time act. It's concerns the pursuit of and fondness for certain external objects. Now, we have to understand that for the Stoics, there are two different kinds of objects that we pursue. What they call choice-worthy objects and indifferent or external objects. Indifferent objects are not things we are indifferent to, but they are neutral in themselves. So the pursuit of money and fame and power are not necessarily bad in themselves, but it's what you do with them. It's how you pursue them. So you can be famous, but use your fame in a virtuous way. That's okay. But for them, there's only one choice-worthy object, only one object that is good in itself and always good, and that's virtue. That's virtue. So the pursuit of these external objects can be sickness, especially concerning, and they come from our fondness for things like money and fame and power. And the reason why we pursue these indifferent objects as if they are choice-worthy, as if our happiness consists in them, the reason why we do that is because we are wrong. We mistakenly overvalue them. We see their value more than what it really is. We think that they are inherently worth pursuing, that they for sure will give us happiness, whereas they are not. They are indifferent objects. Now, this is important background from Stoic philosophy is because there is a similar notion in the dialogue on the soul. For me, the concept of rahimtu, which can be translated as desire, is very close to what the Stoics call fondness. And for him, the reason why this kind of desire of ephemeral things, this fondness of ephemeral things, is bad is because they're mutable and they can change, and you cannot build anything solid on them. And he gives an example of that, the passion of love. He talks about the love of somatic persons. Somatic persons for him are persons at the lowest level of virtue. These are people at the first stage of virtue, could be even underdeveloped virtue. But he talks about how for them their love is false love because it is exactly based on ephemeral things. Let me quote him. The love of somatic persons is not true, since it is from mutable things that it begins to boil in their mind, and on ephemeral things their love rests. It is clear that when these things, which are the cause of their love, change, with them their love is altered. Their love began from beauty, which fades, and from wealth, which ceases, and from authority, which passes. So that's why their love is not true. That's why their love is not false. They're saying at the somatic level, at the lower echelon of virtue, we love people because we desire things they have, whether they're beauty, whether they're the power they represent, or their wealth. But this is not true love because these things may disappear. The person may lose her beauty, or may lose her money, or may lose his power, and then our love will eventually disappear. That's why virtue cannot be built on the desire for these things, because they are mutable. Especially that for him, of course, all things are ephemeral, and only the other world, only the new life is mutable. And what makes me also see this connection between this Stoic fondness and the concept of understanding of passions is that in the dialogue is that for John, desire is at the core of all passions. All our emotions are at their core a desire for something. First, he lists many passions that are a species of the genus desire. I did not mention at the beginning, but although he has a list of the passions of the body and the soul, these lists are not exhaustive, because he lists many other passions that are not that list. But he talks about desire for wealth, for money, for possessions, for beauty, for glory, for praise, desire for authority. So many of the passions that he lists are desire for something, fondness for something. But not only that, even passions that are not strictly or directly a form of desire, at their core, they are fueled by desire. Take for example, envy. I will read what he says here. These passions are not naturally of the soul. That's one of the leitmotifs in his work, that passions are in the soul, but are not part of the nature of the soul, because mostly he wants to say that we can get rid of them, because what is part of the nature we cannot get rid of. So these passions are not naturally of the soul, but because of the things whose need and desire the body is bound, there is a place for these passions in the mind. Tell me then, from where is envy? Is it not because a person desires what he desires, and he sees another who has lots of it, be it wealth or authority or beauty or skill or being known by the nobles? So the point he's making here, that when you envy somebody, maybe it may not look like desire, but we envy them because they have what we desire, and we envy them. Sometimes, let's say I'm angry because someone has insulted me, and it's because I desire to have a good reputation. I desire honor. I'm sad at the loss of something only because I desire that thing that I have lost. So for him, passions are at their core all desire. And what that means is that moral growth, and we'll talk about that in the next talks, requires what Martha Nussbaum calls a therapy of desire, healing our desire. And this connection between viewing the passions as at their core desire is what I see a connection between them and the Stoics who see fondness as a form of sickness themselves. So to conclude, one of the imports of the dialogue on the soul is this emphasis on introspection. You don't see as much emphasis on this in Ephrahat or Ephraim or Jacob of Sarug, whom we see more as traditional, if you will, more Semitic theologians and authors. But he took in-depth psychology and introduced it into the thinking of Christians as a crucial part of moral growth, and as a basis for spiritual exercises to help one grow. Like I said, in the 5th century, in Syriac Christianity, he's the first one that I know of who talks about looking inwards at our thoughts and our passions and emotions and healing them in order for us to grow morally. And there's an interesting shift, if you will, or emphasis here from a moralistic look at vice as sinful, as bad behavior, to talking about it as a disease. And when you look at the medical paradigm, at the medical model of moral life, the emphasis is not so much on condemning, on judging, but on healing, the therapeutic approach to moral life. And that's what I hope I was able to highlight today and underscore in the dialogue on the soul and in the import of John the Solitary and the dialogue for moral theology and for spiritual life. And this will form, like I said, the basis for my second and third talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Father Rodrigue. And I do apologize to you for that line that you see in the middle of the screen. I don't know how it happened. I tried to get rid of it, but I couldn't.
It's okay.
So I do apologize.
I was worried it was something I did.
I do apologize to you and to our viewers and participants. Now we're going to, if anybody has a question, please raise your virtual hand. To do so, click on the reaction button and hit raise hand. Tony Selim.
Rodrigue and everybody. First of all, thanks for this really nice presentation. I, in my own life and growth, I have been trying to study more of the Syriac fathers and the richness there. And this morning, you really helped present in depth one of these important people. This is maybe this is kind of a put on your thinking cap question. How would I recognize in the marketplace the person that John is describing?
Like the Semitic person, for example?
Well, the person that he describes is free of trying to work on his passions and et cetera, et cetera. You know, practically.
Practically, it would be on, you're in the marketplace, what they're buying exactly and how much they're buying, how much, how they behave. Are they behaving in a way to maximize their exposure? Are they looking for honors? Are they greedy? Are they, so for him, yeah, the more attached we are to these goods, the harder we pursue them, the more we take care of what he calls the needs of the body. That's a sign that we are still at the beginning of our moral growth. The more envious we are, the more angry we get at the wrong things, the more fearful we are of things, the more intensely we experience these passions. These are the signs, the symptoms, if you will.
I kind of think, would I want to have a beer with somebody like this?
Probably not. I don't know. But it'll be interesting, make for an interesting conversation, that's for sure. Thank you.
sorry. Father, you mentioned about the evil thoughts, and although it doesn't sound like John of Apamea is too clear on whether they're sinful per se, but I'm wondering how that might relate to our thoughts of, like, often we will say, well, you can be tempted like Jesus was tempted, but it's not a sin.
Yeah.
So how does he make a distinction with that? And also how this might relate to, you mentioned about the moral impact of the passions. What came to my mind was St. Paul, where he talks about, I'm at war with myself. I don't do the things I really want to do, what God wills me to do, that I will to do.
Yeah.
I didn't know if John kind of tackles these conflicting ideas within ourselves, I guess, which is sort of the body and soul at war in a sense.
Yeah, for him, we cannot help for evil thoughts to emerge, but it is our moral responsibility. It is our moral duty to fight them, to not let them turn into or evolve into passions, and definitely not to let them impact how we behave. So he does consider. He does not. I don't know if he used the word sin in the whole of Dialogue on the Soul. Excuse me, more than once or twice. He's not concerned. Evagrius was, some of the other Origin was, and for them, the thoughts in themselves were not sinful yet, because again, they don't surface in our minds. They sometimes surface in our minds without our will, so we cannot be held morally liable for them. So that question was very much debated before him. He's not as much concerned about delineating where sin begins or where sin ends, but definitely he says we have the moral responsibility to extinguish these thoughts, and definitely the passions and behavior.
If I could just kind of follow up on that idea, though, that's interesting, because often I think because of our Western training, especially in the confessional, you got people coming saying, well, I thought of this, did I sin, Father? My answer usually is, I don't know, leave it to God, we'll confess it, let God decide, because sometimes it is hard to determine whether a thought, like we talk about impure thoughts or whatever, is it sinful? Did it just cross your mind and kind of in passing, so.
Well, yeah, these are traditionally criteria. Having an impure thought for 10 seconds is different from entertaining one for 2.5 hours.
Yes.
At some point you can tell, okay, this has gone. This is under this is under my will, under my control, and I'm enjoying this a bit too much. So it is pretty much a subjective determination. But I see, these are the criteria. Did you cause anything for the thought to arise? So did you avoid any of the triggers? Did you avoid the situations that give rise to these impure thoughts?
Sure.
Did you solve them as soon as you could? How much did you indulge in them? So forth, so on and so forth. But like I said, interestingly, this mentality of determining the sinfulness and where exactly it starts and things like that, as opposed to just simply are more responsible for healing them. John is not as much interested in that in the dialogue as other authors have been.
No, it's a beautiful insight, really, from him.
Yeah.
And thank you for your presentation. I started reading, but like Bishop Gregory, I didn't get through it.
I
plan on it.
I couldn't do a better dissertation. A better dissertation would not have been 460 pages, but maybe the book will be better.
Bravo, Abuno.
Thank you, Claude. Vivian?
Okay, thank you. I have to tell you, this was an absolutely awesome presentation. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's very relevant despite its early age. I have a few thoughts. This very much sounds like a precursor to so much of what St. Ignatius wrote in his exercises. And for that, I'm very grateful to have been here for this. He talks, and this is where this whole issue of the passions came out for me. He talks about behaviors and actions, and that the actions, the behavior is not necessarily the sin. However, what comes before, the desire, the thought, the what drives it. And this is very much what you were talking about. And so it was a great link. I also have one other thought to respond to Father Claude. I think somehow when thoughts emerge, maybe they are the temptations, and then the willingness to go with it, and then have these thoughts or temptations become pleasurable fantasies is really where they become more conflicting. And I hate to use the word sin, but those are my two thoughts. Thank you. Thank you for
Thank
the
you,
two.
Vivian. I appreciate that. Yeah, you're right. I think the link between Saint Ignatius and John the Solitary is this. It comes from, I'd say, the tradition of Greek philosophy. If you read Pierre Hadot's philosophy as a way of life, you can see that a certain outlook on life, a certain philosophy, if you will, which we tend to think of as simply a way of looking at things, view of the world, view of humanity. Early philosophers, especially the Stoics and the Epicureans, have translated those into spiritual exercise, into ways of getting to know oneself and heal oneself. And I think this is how it entered Christianity, through Philo, through Origen, Evagrius, and that's how it got to John the Solitary. So I think that's the link, and it continued even as far as the cognitive behavioral psychology today, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's basically that. Look at your thoughts, examine how dysfunctional your thoughts are, and heal your thoughts in order to change your behavior. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's why it's still relevant, because it's still used, today. So thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Vivian. Seely?
Dr. Rodrigue, having worked on John the Solitary myself, you've done an amazing exposition of someone who was not writing in a systematic form. Anybody who's read his wonderful documents has quite a challenge to get some sense, not just sense, but a regular coherence in them. And you've done a very fine job with that.
Thank you.
What intrigued me was something you were speaking about at the beginning, when you talked about John's, his anthropology. It seems to me that John, first of all, had a very optimistic view of creation, and that for him it was the intention of God that human beings be kind of a microcosm, and that the goodness of creation is what they represent. And so I think with John, at least intentionally, was that there is a way of becoming the full man in Christ. And therefore, how do you achieve a harmony between the material side and the spiritual side, or the visible and the invisible? And so, of course, in a dialogue on the soul, he's trying to deal with fundamentals. How does the soul work with the body to achieve that harmony, and what is required? One other thought that came to my mind is that John saw the resurrected Christ as the paradigm for a human future, where the body and soul are in a different dimension, but it's still grounded in the created body that we have here on earth. Do you have any thoughts about that?
About that last part, or about the whole thing?
About the idea that there is the intention that human beings ultimately reach this kind of perfection if they only have intimations of it in this world, but will be fulfilled in the next, as human beings, not as souls or spirits, but as embodied human beings.
Yeah, definitely. Although sometimes, like I said, it would be tempting when you see him, how much emphasis he places places on the soul, you wonder what his view of eschatology is. But he is clear that talks about the transformation of the body. And yeah, in that sense that you talk about the risen Lord being the paradigm, and he sees in the risen Lord the transformation of the body, where the body acquires more of the attributes of the soul. The body becomes spiritualized, and so the body becomes virtuous, and the body becomes, in a sense, subdued to the soul, if you will. It goes under the power of the soul, because it's a reversal of how sometimes we experience ourselves in this world, where the desires of the body tend to lead the soul and tend to overpower it. So in that sense, the risen Lord is a paradigm of this ultimate harmony, which is achieved in the eschatology. I'm not sure I answered your question correctly, though. Oh, I answered your question, yeah.
Yes, you have. It's just that I believe that John was even optimistic about the fact, to answer Father Tony's question, that we here on earth can reach quite a harmony through a life of whatever be asceticism of one form or another, that we can get that balance, at least to a great degree.
To a great degree. Although he does seem to be, he's perfect virtue for him is only eschatological. And he says the least God expects of us in this life is to purify ourselves from passion. So he sets a minimum. That's the least you have to accomplish. If you have not purified yourself of your passions, which is in a way a negative form of growth, getting rid of the bad stuff as opposed to acquiring the virtuous stuff. He says that's the least God expects of us in this world. Now, how much virtue we attend after that is reserved to the few. Is reserved to the few. Not everyone can attend this life of virtue for him. The stages of moral growth, everyone needs to grow beyond the first stage. Very few attend the last third stage on earth. So but still for him, purifying yourself of your passions is an amazing feat. For him, it's more honorable than being victorious in battle.
Thank you, Seely. Sebastian? Sebastian? I think it's...
presentation. Thank you so much. Yes, I can't do anything about my internet connection. It is very bad. And sometimes fails in the middle. But anyhow, it didn't fail in the middle of your talk, thank heavens. But I'd like to say how much I appreciated the dedication to Mary Hansbury, the translator of this wonderful dialogue. I knew Mary quite well. She would visit and correspond with a lot. But one particular question, which I hope isn't too academic, do you think John knew Evagrius' writings? I'd love to know if you had...
The interesting question is if he knew it in what language, because we know that the translations of the Practicos and the Kephalia were available during his time. I think he did know them, but I think he also rejected them at least partially, because he does not adopt the idea that, for example, the idea that these thoughts are also demons. There's very little talk of demons in the dialogue on the soul. I think that Evagrius could have been the conduit to his knowledge of could have been partly how he got to know some of the Greek philosophy, and I think his attention to the passions and thoughts definitely I think there's a high probability that he has read Evagrius. Now the problem with John, he does not quote anyone besides Scripture. And so it's hard to pin down what his sources are. But I think it's very likely that he has read the Vagries. Yes.
Thank you.
Some of his even some of the Syriac words he uses for like vihimtu and himtu for and these are also in the Vagries, and some of the names he has for the passions are also I also was able to find in S1, S2, and the Practicus, but it remains a hypothesis.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Bishop?
Thank you, Father Rodrigue. This has really been wonderful, as your thesis has been. Thank you. I love the field of virtue ethics, especially in moral theology, which is very, very helpful. And I love especially the emphasis from a moralistic to a medicinal. I think that's a huge breakthrough. And it's good to know that it came from the Syriac fathers, because the Syriac church was the first place to have hospitals and talk about medicine. So we predate the West in all of those things. But my thought is getting to the question of moving from the moralistic to the medicinal. I'm reading some things on addiction, and especially Gerald May's Addiction and Grace. And the insight is really invaluable. It's the same insight from John. And that is how to turn with God's grace from our addictions, from our preoccupations that don't find their full end in God, to something. And I just want to close with a thought, and I want your thoughts about this. Theodore McCarrick is a good example of this. I read recently a review about him from a medicinal point of view rather than a moralistic point of view. And it really, really helped me. And the point was that his passion of the soul was to have young men have a great adoration towards him. That kind of he was fixated in this this passion that he had in his deepest part of his soul, and so he crossed the boundary many times. And we unfortunately moralized and condemned him. But a medicinal approach would say, Theodore, this is where you needed to have a medicinal treatment, and it could have helped you had someone intervened earlier. What your thoughts on that, Father Rodrigue?
Thank you, Bishop. You brought up, more than one good point. The first one is the contribution of the dialogue on the soul to virtue ethics, and it's important. It's a very important contribution, because it's strictly not virtue ethics that he's proposing. It's what I call vice ethics, because his insight is before you acquire virtue, you need to cure your diseases. First things first. And that's something that is not talked about in Western virtue ethics currently. There's no talk of vice. There's no talk of purification, as if we're starting from a clean slate. Start learning virtue through habituation. Start learning to eat right. Start learning to be temperate and be courageous. But what if I have these vices, before? It's like somebody coming in with a broken leg and saying, okay, start learning to run. It's like, no, you heal the broken leg first. So I think that's the biggest contribution of the dialogue on the soul to the and the ascetic literature in general to virtue ethics. Second, I don't think, the medicinal therapeutic approach, I think, does lend itself to more compassion, and I see that in the approach of Pope Francis to the Christian moral life, when he talks about the church being a hospital field and all these wounded people coming in and looking for healing. So from that perspective, but I firmly believe that both if you want to call it moralistic and medicinal, they go hand in hand. And that's also one of the insights of the dialogue on the soul, is that we are morally responsible for healing those passions. So yeah, any of us who sins, McCarrick included, yeah, there's a reason for it. Yeah, there's a sickness behind it. But what has he done? What do we do to heal those sickness, to heal those passions? I do believe we can both at the same time be wounded, but also evil. Now, evil in this perspective is not arbitrary, it's not random, it's not gratuitous. It comes from a certain wound. It's not in that sense pure evil, but it still can be condemned as evil. People have been hurt by him. We hurt other people. So I think the two have to go hand in hand, and emphasizing only one of them can be problematic. The moralistic alone can lead to being overly judgmental. The therapeutic alone can sometimes be seen as almost excusing kind of behavior. But I think we need to keep both in perspective. We're wounded people who wound other people.
Thank you, Bishop. Jomana?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much, Father. I have a question. When you were talking about the partnership between the bodily senses and the senses of the soul, I was a little confused. I asked myself, does the soul has senses? Like, can you elaborate more on that, please?
Sure. Yeah, I went over this one a bit too quickly, so thank you for your question. The idea of spiritual senses comes from Origins, also President Gregory of Nyssa, so it does not start with John the Solitary. But what he calls spiritual senses are things like reasoning, discernment, judgment, things like that. So these are what he calls the senses of the soul. And he often just uses that expression without really, in only one place, and not in the dialogue, in a letter that he wrote where he elaborates on what these senses of the soul are. But think of them that way as faculties, as faculties of reasoning. And for him, the conjunction between the two, the partnership between body and soul, is that the bodily senses give us information of what we see, what we smell, what the object is, and then the soul makes sense of it. The soul evaluates it, and the soul can even, takes it beyond what can be seen with the visible eye. So he gives an example of the moon. He says, you may look at the moon, and the moon can be big, and you may think that the moon is close through only bodily senses, but then through the senses of the soul, through your reasoning and judgment, you know that's only because of the positioning of the moon, compared to the earth, things like that. He says that with the bodily senses, you can see a house, but through the eyes of the mind, through the spiritual sense of the soul, you can know that there are people living inside. You can see what is even beyond what is visible. So that is the partnership between the two that he talks about. But yeah, the senses of the soul are that for him, reasoning, judgment, discernment, etc.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jomana. Any other questions? My friend Rodrigue, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you for presenting your talk on the diseases of the soul. And we look forward to your second talk on Thursday, April 22nd, Psychology, Therapy, and Moral Growth. And for your third talk on April 29th, the 3 levels of moral growth. Also, I would like to remind our participants that the Jacob of Sarug conference continues next week, April 21st at 10 a.m. Our guest speaker is Muriel Dubier, and her talk is on Jacob of Sarug and his time preaching in late antique Mesopotamia. I thank all of you for coming, joining us, and I thank my friend Rodrigue for this wonderful presentation, and we look forward to hearing you next week.
The opportunity sitting down with the rest of you. Thank you for the attention. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon.